Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Shehan.
Hello, everybody. This is the College Football Survivor Show, where we are all about the race for the College Football Playoff Championship. I'm Bobak Shehan, and I'm joined by the infinitely informed Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and you can always send us feedback. As a podcast, we always appreciate it when you take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to our show wherever you find us. Good reviews help people find more. We're on a mission to find the ultimate survivor in the college football playoff race, with a pair of playoff games coming up on January 1st. We continue our series going through each playoff team with those who cover them in depth. Today, we're going to be looking at the number one college football playoff ranked team, Michigan. Shehan, I don't know about you, but I have a notice of level 1 excitement for this matchup. How are you? How about you?
I do too. You know, obviously Michigan, I think this year, and a lot of the year has been I don't want to say like least challenged team, but they've been the most perfect team, I think, that you can say for most of the season. They haven't played very many close games. They've handled their business every single week. I'm really curious to kind of get into the weeds because, you know, obviously this is Michigan's third time in the playoff, and certainly it would be great if it was their first time to win a playoff game.
Absolutely. There's so many stories going on here, but let me go ahead and introduce our guest. We are joined again by Aaron McMann, the chief beat writer for the University of Michigan football program at MLive Media Group, where he's worked since 2014. He took the Michigan football beat in 2017 and has served as an authoritative voice on Jim Harbaugh's Wolverines, garnering several awards. We're happy to have him back. Last time we spoke was ahead of the game with Penn State, when we thought we'd finally get to see what these Wolverines were made of, the head coach or not. And this time with the head coach going into this game. Aaron, thanks for joining us again.
Guys, it's good to be back. As you guys said, third straight year for Michigan. I think they're eager to finally get over the hump and win a game. It's good to be back with you.
You know, one thing I wanted to mention, and I know I said this right before we went on the air, but pound for pound, the most adventurous beat this season in college football has to have been covering the Michigan Wolverines. Like, the story never ends. We thought there was a bit of a calm, and then the NCAA comes out with, you know, something about a cheeseburger during the COVID years. But I mean, you know, it's constant, this churn. And it's funny, too, because I was thinking we were getting a playoff run, even though they're not in the college football playoff, by Florida State in terms of offseason news or just news in general that was going to make up this gap. But man, Michigan just does not give. I mean, we were talking about. I mean, you just wrote a story about Alabama hiring, of course, a former Michigan assistant coach. You know, that there's just so much of an adventure going around there. But at the same time, they're trying to focus on getting into the playoff and finally winning at least one round. It's absolutely a fascinating thing. For you, what is the tone of the program right now?
Well, I think. I hesitate to say this, but maybe cautious optimism. I mean, as I just said, this is their third straight playoff appearance, and they haven't been able to win a semifinal game. And I think there's a need and desire to do that. As you said, this team's been through a lot this year. They've lost assistant coaches. Their head coach was sidelined for 6 games. They've dealt with injuries and everything else, and it seems like every obstacle that's been put in front of them, they've been able to overcome. And so far, I mean, you can't write them off. I mean, the 13-0 Big Ten champions again. They're the number 1 seed for the first time. So the college football world, at least the playoff committee, has respected them and the job that they've done on the field. So, I think they're eager to prove folks wrong. I think that's kind of been the tenor of the program all season long, right? Like, they came into the year knowing Jim Harbaugh was going to be sidelined and they're under NCAA investigation. They lose assistant coaches. They lose Harbaugh again, and they're under the Big Ten probe. It just seems like it's been one thing after another, and still they've come out on the right side every single time.
You know, after 13 games, how do you kind of compare this Michigan team versus the last two?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think in some areas they're better than maybe last year, and then some areas not so much. So, I guess we'll start on the offensive side of the ball. I do think this is probably Michigan's the best year they've gotten quarterback play. I think J.J. McCarthy is obviously better than he was last year. He's more dynamic. They've kind of added added dimension to his game with his legs. I think has helped. At the same token, the bread and butter of the Michigan offense that they've kind of built the last couple of years around the ground game maybe hasn't been as effective. I don't think this offensive line has been as good as it's been the last couple of years. They've been rotating guys in and out. They've been dealing with injuries. I just don't think the play top to bottom has been as good. But then they've gotten, I think, better play from the receivers. So the offense has been a mixed bag, whereas the defense, I think this might be cohesively as a unit the best that they've had in the last couple of years. And that's saying something, because you can remember they had Aiden Hutchinson a couple of years ago. It was a top draft pick. They had another first round pick in David Ajabo. So I think as a unit, they're more well-oiled. I think they got some exceptional playmakers on the back end. So I think this defense is better than it's ever been, and I think this offense is better in certain areas, but not necessarily where you think. And I think that's been, I think, maybe the biggest surprise to this Michigan team.
Heading into this, their third time at the Apple, or at the very least, the final step to the Apple. We look back at the last two times they were in the playoffs. Obviously, that first time they were a bit outmatched by Georgia. Second time, they just had critical mental mistakes against TCU, and especially J.J. McCarthy. How are they? Is there a difference in how they're preparing for this particular semifinal? Because you figure at this point, third time might be a charm, or at the very least, they have a pattern to work with.
Yeah, they've kind of changed up the routine. They started practice about a week and a half ago now. It sounds like there's less hitting to begin things. I don't know exactly what it looks like, because obviously we're not privy to practice. We're not allowed in the doors. But based on what they've told us, yes, it's kind of been a slower build. This time last year, Michigan was an incredibly banged up unit. Blake Corum was injured and out. The guys, along the offensive line banged up. So I think they've learned from the last couple of years that maybe a slower build is better than maybe go all out practice. Because if you go back 2 years ago and players kind of on the team now admit it, they'll tell it to us. But, at that point, I think they were just happy to get to the playoff. They'd never been before. They just won their first Big Ten championship under Jim Harbaugh. So in a way, it was kind of a vacation. The game was in South Florida. So I think they were kind of eating it up. They were enjoying the warm weather and everything else. And they didn't really know what to expect. And you're right, on the field, they were just overmatched. I mean, Georgia was by far the best team that year. They really had no real shot. Last year, they went into the game against TCU in the Fiesta Bowl as the favorite. I think everyone and their brother picked Michigan to win that game. And it turned out to be a track meet. It was something Michigan wasn't really prepared to play in, something that they weren't equipped to play in. And you're right, they shot themselves in the foot. J.J. McCarthy throws a pair of pick sixes. They fumbled at the goal line. They settled for field goals instead of touchdowns, and ended up losing that game by a possession. So it wasn't really the Michigan team we had seen all season long. So the last 2 years on this stage, they've really stumbled. I think they acknowledge that. And really, if you go back to Jim Harbaugh's real entirety here at Michigan, he's 1-6 in bowl games. They really struggle on the big stage, and I think they know that.
What do you think it is about, whether it's a Harbaugh team, whether it's about the way that this team is built, that, when you are going to this national stage, when you do have a month to prepare, why do you think it hasn't worked right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it comes down to, and players are talking about this week, maybe overanalyzing things and over preparing and overthinking. I think there's something to that. In the way the players were talking this week, it almost made it sound like maybe they felt like they over practiced last year leading up to the game against TCU. Maybe that, they did too much. And they spoke about it after the game last year, where I think that TCU pulled out some stuff that they weren't prepared for either. So in a way, I think there's something kind of leaning back on what got you to this point, and trusting the players and trusting your scheme and your ability. And I think that's probably what they're going to do this year. I mean, they are slight favorites right now. But I think the general public, perceives the SEC this year as being just top to bottom better than the Big Ten. So I think there's this assumption going in that maybe Florida is the more physical, bigger team, and maybe Michigan has trouble. And so I'm really curious to see how that plays out. Michigan has struggled historically against SEC programs. Not only did they lose to Georgia a couple of years ago, but they lost to Alabama in the Citrus Bowl pretty convincingly back in 2020. So obviously different teams, different personnel, but there's no doubt about it. Nick Saban has excelled at this level. I think he's 6-1 in CFP semifinal games, so he knows how to prepare. And he said this month as well, leading up to this game, where he's acknowledged too that looking back on previous appearances, he thinks they practice too much too. So I think there's this slow build for both programs, and I think they're going to so they can let it all out in January 1st.
The way you've talked about it, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but you've made me realize it would be very interesting now to see how they would react to a 12-team playoff if they were to get into that, because then it'll be a much shorter preparation period. You don't have those weeks to get into your own head. And then, again, with TCU, oh, we didn't prepare for this, maybe, and just, there's this kind of panic on the sideline. My goodness. But drilling back down to this particular game coming up, we've talked about how different is JJ McCarthy than the person we saw against TCU?
I think he's a year older, more mature, and that's probably the obvious answer here. But I do think it's cut down some of the mistakes he's made. Last year, he was his first year starter, and at times you could make the case he was a little wild with his decision making. He'd make a throw maybe he shouldn't have. He'd make a decision he shouldn't have. And while he's done that occasionally this year, it hasn't been as often. He had a 3-interception game against Bowling Green, and that was really the only blunder on his year. He's otherwise played exceptionally well. His completion rate's near 75%. His quarterback rating is off the charts. I think third in the country. So from what they've asked him to do, he's been relatively effective. Now he doesn't have maybe the passing yards that some of the other premier quarterbacks in the country have, just by kind of default by nature of the Michigan offense. They're still running the football at a 60% clip. So they're just not utilizing him as much. And then the second part of that, I think, is his legs. I think he's gotten smarter and better about utilizing them and knowing when to utilize them. He's not afraid to pick up a first down. I mean, he's a mobile quarterback. I wouldn't call him necessarily a dual threat, but he has the athletic ability to take off when he needs to and pick up those yards to get a first down and just kind of move Michigan down the field.
For me, when I look at Michigan, when I look at this game, I mean, again, it's hard not to look at the last couple of these things, right? And I think for me, when I look at that Iowa game, after Zach Zinter goes out, right? I mean, they rushed under 2 yards per carry. Their offense, I mean, they're lucky that Florida State was playing on that day because their offense kind of looked like a mess and it kind of got lost in everything. Even last year, though, against TCU, right? After that first Donovan Edwards rush, kind of struggled to move the ball on the ground, wasn't able to move the ball on the ground against Georgia. So, I mean, I think my question with this is, if Michigan gets off schedule with the run, right? If Alabama is able to cause them issues, like what do they do? Like, do they have another gear? Do they have another plan to kind of make up for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I certainly think they would try to throw the football, but I think that would play right into Alabama's hands, right? You've got a couple of really 3 excellent defensive backs back there, potential first round picks. And I don't necessarily think that's how Michigan wants to win the football game. Ideally, they get up, they move the football, or they run the football in between the tackles. They kind of control the clock and tempo. That's ideally Michigan's game offensively. Hasn't always worked, but it has when they needed it to, against Penn State, at times against Ohio State. So it certainly wouldn't benefit Michigan. I think they're certainly going to get up to the line of scrimmage and ideally want to run the football. But the same token, too, as I was pointing out earlier, like I don't know if that's necessarily going to be effective either, just because Michigan's offense line isn't what it was the last couple of years coming into the year. And then you mentioned Zach Zinter being out for the season with a season-ending injury. So they've had to do some shuffling up front. It didn't look very good against Iowa. We spoke to the offensive line coach, offensive coordinator Sharon Moore earlier this week, and he said they're doing different things with the offensive line in practice. He obviously wouldn't go into detail. So I think they realize they need better push up front, and that's the trenches are really going to how they're going to win this game. I think if they could run the football relatively well, eat up clock, and keep the football out of Jalen Milroe's hands, that's the ideal scenario here. Now, last year that's what they wanted to do. Like you said, they couldn't do it, and they got into a track meet, and you saw what happened. So. I don't know. This game is gonna be on Blake Corum's hand, in kind of on his shoulders. He really didn't play the last couple of years in the bowl games. He was out injured. This year he's healthy. So, and he was the one that kind of, began the whole national title or bust talk before the season. So I think there's a lot of pressure on him in the run game. Donovan Edwards is gonna have to show up, and I said it a couple of days ago, but I do think they're gonna have the game of their career. I think.
No pressure in the final year of a conceptual Rose Bowl that's probably as close as we're going to get to what they historically were. Another thing that struck me as we talk about this, of course, we have to always kind of benchmark the fact that Michigan is playing some of the best defenses in the nation. We were just talking, as you mentioned, the SEC has a reputation of being strong, but we don't know until these bowl games really how good these leagues were, heading into the season. Early on we were all talking about how amazing the Pac-12. What if Washington goes and lays an egg? We're kind of like, oh, okay, I guess maybe that was the best that they had. But going towards sort of how Michigan can adapt to what's going on with Alabama. How much are we going to see guys like Colston Loveland and AJ Barner, those great tight ends, kind of be implemented to create some mismatches especially among the linebackers in Alabama?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the passing game, I think the utilization of the tight ends is going to be key. And Michigan hasn't been afraid to use them the last couple of years, really under Jim Harbaugh's entire tenure. He's kind of built the back and the passing game on the tight end. So when the receivers on the outside aren't open or aren't getting separation, you could always rely on the guys over the middle of the tight end. So Colston Loveland will be a key playmaker in this game. Dick Saban actually singled him out, I think, earlier this week. I think they realize that, they acknowledge that. And look, Loveland showed up in big games before. I mean, he had he's played well this year, especially early on. He played well last year in the Big Ten championship game, and obviously in the playoff too. So, for only being a sophomore, he's a lot more mature than maybe he comes across, or maybe it looks on paper. But yeah, that's going to be key. I mean, getting guys open over the middle of the field, avoiding the edges, right? Like, Alabama's defensive ends are elite. Their quarterbacks are elite. So I think Michigan has to do everything that possible to avoid the outside and attack the middle of the field, whether that's on the ground or over the middle of the field with the slant routes or the tight ends or anything else. So I think if Michigan's effective in the passing game, that's certainly where it's going to be with the tight ends.
Obviously after the playoff matchups were announced, there was that video that went around of Michigan once they saw that Alabama was the team that they're going to be playing. I don't know if you were in the room for that or if you got to talk to them after that. What was that? I mean, do you feel like that was overblown? Do you feel like they really didn't want that in the first round? What kind of was that?
Yeah, I do think it was overblown. I was in the room with them. They let us in and we watched, the whole ceremony with them. And I will point out when they were, because if you remember, go back and watch the telecast, they were announced as number one seed before the bowl matchups were announced. And I can tell you when they were unveiled as number one seed, there wasn't much of a reaction either. So I think it was more of a hangover, more or less, from the end of the Big Ten championship game. You got to remember that was noon Eastern time when that was announced. They played in the Big Ten championship game the night before. It didn't end until about midnight Eastern time. They didn't get back to the hotel until 2 or 3. And from what I was told, many of them probably didn't go to bed till 4 or 5. So you got a lot of like starry-eyed guys in there who were just eating breakfast. So I think it was more or less just the hangover from the night before. Now, I will say, in talking to the guys afterwards, they were a bit surprised it wasn't Florida State. I think, but I do think that going in there, I mean, it was well known it was either going to be Florida State or Alabama. So I mean, ideally, they probably wanted to play Florida State. Certainly a better matchup for them. But, you got the vibe pretty quickly. They were excited. I mean, Blake Corum was even talking. Like, he's got a high school teammate, Chris Braswell, on the Alabama side. He was looking forward to playing. So I think it was overblown because, again, I compared to when they were unveiled as number one seed, and it was very similar.
Yeah, he's going to have a fun game to go up against his old teammate as well as Dallas Turner on the other side of the ball. But going over to the Michigan defense, because as you said, it just seems overall it's a solid. It's one of the best defenses out there, and it's kind of funny because we don't necessarily. We were talking about Texas earlier with they've got a couple of guys who you know by name and you immediately reach for them. But one of the things and one of the tasks that we should talk about is how Michigan's going to go about containing Jalen Milroe, because he's probably the most explosive quarterback that the Wolverines have faced. He has an ability to run around and throw it, and that has been historically something that has been a problem for Michigan. What approach should we expect to see from the Wolverines in doing that?
Yeah, I mean, they've played one other mobile quarterback this year, and Talia Tagovailoa at Maryland. So I don't know how much of a comparison there is. I mean, we've asked players this week about those guys, and that's kind of what they've leaned on in preparation so far. They've went back and watched Maryland film, obviously, on top of Alabama. So they have had experience going against a mobile quarterback. They did a decent job against Talia. He really hurt them last year, and I think they learned from this year. So I think there is something to lean on, but obviously Jalen Milroe is probably a little bit different beast. I mean, he's a better overall quarterback. He has gotten better as the season has gone on. So I think obviously keeping an eye on him and tackling him at the point of contact is going to be key. Look, I think, and I think there's this realization too that Milroe does like to hold on to the football a long time. So I think one of the things that Michigan's defense has done a very good job of this year is forcing turnovers and getting the football out. And I think if there's one area where they can exploit Alabama and specifically Milroe, it's the turnovers. Their offensive line's given up a lot of sacks. Part of that is Milroe holding on to the football a lot. He's thrown a handful of interceptions himself and fumbled the football. So I think tackling is going to be key. He's going to get his yards. I think they acknowledge that, but it's not, letting a 4 or 5 yard gain turn into an 8, 9, 10, or even worse. So they have experience doing it. Obviously, not maybe against this type of offensive line, and really that's been the difficult part this week. Kind of the revelation of talking to some of the Michigan players. And while they're trying to simulate preparing for Jalen Milroe, and they have experience doing so, it's been more difficult simulating against the size of the Alabama offensive line. So I think that's going to be the key to watch here, how Michigan's defensive front is able to hold up or get push on the Alabama offensive line.
Yeah, I mean, this 2-year run, obviously Michigan cancels the UCLA series, so that's part of the scheduling quirks of the last 2 years. But I mean, like, how much do you think, I don't want to say has it affected Michigan, but the fact that, I mean, they basically have only played 2 quality games to this point. I mean, next year we're going to get to see them play a couple more of these things, right? We're going to see the USCs. We're going to get to see, just a different kind of matchup. But like, I mean, you mentioned the top quarterbacks they've faced. I mean, Taulia is a good player. I mean, nothing that they've kind of faced otherwise really prepares them for this. I mean, how do you think that kind of affects that team? And how do you think, like you said, are they preparing for it?
Yeah, I think we're going to find out, right? If Michigan's for real once they're on this big stage. Part of it, obviously, is scheduling, right? The last 2 years, they've got knocked for their non-conference scheduling, and as you said, they've gotten out of key series, UCLA. They were supposed to, I think, play with Virginia Tech last year, so they've certainly traded those marquee non-conference matchups for quote unquote easier games, not basically guaranteed victories, and obviously that's what they turned into. Now, part of it too is I think the Big Ten was down this year, top to bottom. I think any outside observer will tell you that. I don't think the Big Ten was as good as they have been in previous years. Ohio State wasn't the offense that they were the last couple of years. Penn State was not very good offensively. The quality of the quarterback play wasn't great. So you're right. Michigan just hasn't had a lot to draw upon and maybe necessarily challenge them a ton. So that's why I'm curious to see. And it's really been difficult to kind of project this game because I think Alabama's on a different level, top to bottom. I think the SEC is better than the Big Ten. I don't think there's many folks that are going to, at least this year, that are going to debate that. And how Michigan's style of play translate is going to be key to watch because, yes, I mean, these are big physical, probably better players than they've seen all season long. And how they hold up against them is going to be interesting because, yeah, while maybe some of them don't have the numbers like the receivers or the running backs that maybe Michigan's guys have, you can make the case they've gone against better competition. So that's why they line up and play the game. And I think we're going to find out pretty quickly if Michigan's, able to hold up.
On the 2021 team, you mentioned it before, but Aiden Hutchinson, David Ojabo, 2 of the best edge rushers in the country, super dynamic players. To me, from afar, it feels like the Michigan strengths have really been linebacker and some of these secondary pieces too. How do you feel like they match up when it comes to like setting an edge and keeping Jalen Milroe in the pocket? Because I mean, obviously, once things get out of the pocket with him, it's just kind of anything goes at that point.
Yeah. So they don't really have the elite edge rusher this year, and I think they realized that. They realized that before the season began, and it's one of the reasons why they've kind of gone to this rotational system. They use 4 edge rushers regularly to the point where they get basically even number of snaps in the game. So it's A, to, I think, give opponents a different look, and B, keep their guys fresh so that they're not playing, 30, 40 snaps a game, and they're able to split those up. So, you'll see 2 edge rushers one series, and the next series you might see 2 others, and they have no problem, subbing in and out even during a lengthy drive. So it's one of those things where I think they're going to have to keep their guys fresh. And get them and try and maximize their value because you're right. There is no Aiden Hutchinson. There is no David Ojabo or first round pick. I mean, Jalen Harrell's probably the best of the bunch. And right now, it wouldn't surprise me if he comes back for another year. So That's going to be key. I think they're going to have to set the edge, keep their eye on Milroe, and not let him get too far outside the pocket and make something happen. Because at the end of the day, that's where the Alabama offense is going to burn you. And that's where Michigan doesn't want to get into a track meet and give up too many points. Because ideally, if they get in a track meet like they did last year against TCU, it's probably not going to work out well.
Yeah, speaking of Jalen Harrell and that entire crew, seems like we're going to see an interesting matchup on the line with Caden Proctor because the freshman, he's been decent, but for Alabama, that's he's been a weak spot in that line. How do you see that matchup going? Because if we're talking about some of the key matchups, and we can talk about more, but watching that, how they can get that pressure, because if you can create that pressure, you can create that stress and perhaps throw Milroe off. How do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, if Michigan's going to get pressure, it's probably going to be right on Proctor. Like, as you said, the offensive line has at times been shaky. Their tackles have had issues. I think they've gotten better as season's gone on. But yeah, I mean, Harrell will be key, right? He's Michigan sacks leader. He's really good at getting pressure. He's probably the most experienced of the group of four guys that they kind of rotate in there. So if the pressure's going to come, it's probably going to come from him. So. It'll be key. I think the more pressure, and then this is probably an obvious statement, the more pressure Michigan get on Milroe, the better. I mean, you got to make his life as uncomfortable as possible. You don't want to give him time in the pocket because the longer you do, obviously, the better. The more likely they're going to make a play, and he's going to make a play. And they've learned that. As I said, they went up against Talia. They have had experience against mobile quarterbacks. So I think they know what it's going to take. But knowing what it's going to take and actually executing it are two different things once you get on the field.
So this is kind of a big picture question, but should I be concerned about the fact that in essentially their two biggest games of the year, they went away from their quarterback? Like, should I be concerned about that?
Yeah, I think part of the design for doing that was JJ McCarthy's health. He was banged up. He's been playing on a bum ankle now for several weeks. He says he's healthy now. I don't necessarily know if I buy it because a few weeks ago before the Ohio State game, he said he was fine too. So it's all going to come down to McCarthy's health. I think if he's able to move in and out of the pocket and is relatively healthy, I think they feel like they have a longer leash with him. They can kind of let him do more. But I do think they're protecting him there. And remember the Penn State game that Michigan got up early. And at that point, Jim Harbaugh was not on the sideline. It was Sharon Moore running the offense, and Sharon's the offensive line coach. He likes to run the football, and that was kind of he saw that what was working, and they figured, well, because Penn State can't stop it, we're just going to keep doing it. Throw in the fact that JJ was hurt, and they don't want to risk aim tech taking a sack, exacerbating the injury. So I think it's come down to McCarthy's health. If they feel like they can do more with him, they're going to. If not, they're going to do more to protect him and try and run the football. So I don't know. I think JJ McCarthy is probably the difference maker here. He's probably going to determine whether Michigan wins or loses this game, and not necessarily with his arm. I do think his legs are key here. If he can strain and get outside the pocket, force Alabama to kind of do some different things and make some mistakes, it's going to help. So I think that was more the reason that they went away from him, less so than maybe by the offensive design.
It kind of goes to, I know he's been nursing an injury through the season that's limited his mobility a little bit. Both that and what other, should we expect him to be able to be at that level where he can move on his feet more by the time we get to the Rose Bowl? Or I know part of it is, I get you keep those things close to the vest if you're a coach. But from what you've seen, have you seen enough improvement that we should expect some more mobility from him?
It's tough. I will say this, after the Big Ten championship game, when we were there for the CFP unveiling with the team, JJ looked like he was hopping around. Now that was December 3rd. We did talk to him earlier this week. He seemed fine. But again, we're not privy to practice. We're not able to see. So that time will tell, I guess. The good thing for him in Michigan is they basically have 4 weeks to kind of nurse that. They had a week off after the Big Ten championship game where they did not practice. They didn't do anything. And I think players were given time off. So that probably helped him. He says he's fine, but we'll see. He's been saying he's fine for a month and a half, and Michigan has kind of shied away from maybe fully maximizing his potential.
Heading into this matchup with Alabama, I mean, if this goes well, what does this look like for Michigan? If this goes poorly, what does this look like for Michigan? And what do you kind of think happens?
Yeah, if it goes well, they'd run the football. Blake Corum probably eclipsed the 100-yard mark. In fact, a little nugget, he's one rushing touchdown away from setting the Michigan all-time record for rushing touchdowns. So that's something to pay attention to. If they get inside the red zone or, getting on the goal line, he's going to get the football. That's kind of been the story of the MO all year. So they're going to have to run the football. Not necessarily for, 200 or 300 yards, but they've got to sustain some drives on the ground. Hit some deep shots, not necessarily, a 40, 50-yarder, but they've got to be able to connect on a couple times. I think if they can stress Alabama's defensive backs, I think that's going to be key. And then, as you guys mentioned earlier, utilizing the tight ends. I think if Colston Loveland can get 3 or 4 catches for 70, 80 yards and keep drives alive, that's going to be crucial. And then defensively, limiting the big plays. I think when Milroe and Alabama's offense is effective, and I think they're top 10 in the country in plays of like 20 yards or more. So if they can limit those, I think, and keep Alabama out of the end zone, I think that's ideal situation. Holding the field goals as opposed to touchdowns. That's kind of been the model of the Michigan defense the last couple of years. Bend don't break. They will give up yards. They will allow teams to drive the field, but when push comes to shove, either force a turnover or a full no field goal. So I think ideally that's what happens if Michigan wins. If they lose, I think any one of those will have to go wrong, where like they're not running the football at all, or they're giving up touchdowns and big plays. That will probably bury them. Michigan hasn't been in many situations this year where they've had their backs against the wall and where they've kind of had to come from behind. They've led most of the way. Even going back to the Ohio State game, they led most of that game and they kind of dictated the pace and dictated things. So if they're fall behind early, that's going to be trouble. We saw that last year against TCU, and they were never able to recover. So I think that would be a result in a loss.
Yeah, it's funny because, when you think of Alabama and field goals, historically, that wasn't always their forte, but Will Reichert seems to at least be a consistent kicker for them. There's a lot of ifs into this question, but if they were to go to the national championship, which of the 2 Sugar Bowl teams would Michigan most want to play?
Most want to.
Or I'd say who they match up with better. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, probably Texas. They play more Michigan style of ball. Washington, again, would be another kind of mobile quarterback, and Michael Penix, who can get outside the pocket, extend plays, and make those deep, and connect in those deep shots. You've also got a couple former Michigan staffers on that Washington staff that I think probably know Michigan a little bit better than Texas. So I think if you're the Wolverines, you'd probably rather match up against Texas. I think that would be the ultimate scenario. I will say this: if Michigan can beat Alabama in the Rose Bowl in advance, I think their chances to win the national championship are very good. I think they match up pretty well against Texas and Washington, either one. Of the 3 opponents, I think if you would have asked any of us before, I think Alabama would have been the least desirable matchup. Even Florida State would have been better. So. Either way, I think Michigan has a good shot of winning the national championship if they can get by Alabama. But again, it requires getting by the Crimson Tide first.
Yeah, and last kind of thing from me. What would it mean for this season? They've put so much into it. They've kind of tried to protect Jim Harbaugh through it. They've kind of tried to preserve this season in so many ways because of how many upperclassmen leaders that they have on this team. The first bit is, what would it mean for this program and for Harbaugh to win a national championship? But the other side of this is, what would it mean to have all of this and lose in the first round again?
Yeah, it would mean a lot. Blake Corum spoke before the season began. It's national championship or bust. And players have acknowledged that even the last couple of weeks. Like, if we lose this game, the season is a failure. A lot of these guys came back for this year, Blake Corum included. A couple of the offensive linemen, Zach Zinner, who was unable to play in this game. A lot of these guys came back to, they were unsatisfied, right? They'd won another Big Ten championship, but they hadn't been able to get over the hump in the college football playoff. So this really is for it all. They've got to win this game. They've got to essentially win a national championship. Now, you can make the case if they win this game and lose a national championship, there was progress made and they got to the title and everything else. But those guys came back here to win it all, and I think anything less would be a disappointment. And any one of them will acknowledge that. Jim Harbaugh would probably acknowledge that because they've been here. They're no strangers to the playoff scenario now. They've been here. This is their 3rd time. They know what to expect. They've been through this before. This is not an inexperienced team. You got a lot of fourth, fifth, and even sixth year guys. Michael Barrett's in his sixth year. Guys who have been here a long time, been through the ringer, know what's taken, been through the losses, and they're ready to win it all.
On a lighter note, do you think they'll win the Lowry's Beef Bowl? Do they do that for the semifinal?
Yeah, they are doing it. I don't know the particulars. I think they pick a couple of guys to eat. So I don't know. So without knowing who Michigan's putting up there, without
knowing the matchup,
it's hard to handicap, right? I don't know. I'm excited to go. I guess we're allowed to go.
Let me ask you, of Michigan's roster, who would you pick as your all beef bowl team for that? Who would be your champions?
So I got to go to one of the lines, right? So like Kenneth Grant, he's probably 340. He'd probably be a good option. Drake Nugent, their center, he's undersized for a center. I think he's under 300, but he seems like a guy who could eat very well. So I'd probably consider him. So I don't know, probably any of the linemen. Chris Jenkins, it's probably a defensive tackle is probably good. I think you can't go wrong, right? Like unless there's some eater we don't know about, maybe the tight ends eat well, Colston Loveland. But right, that seems obvious, right? Going the lines are the bigger guys.
Yeah, because competitive eaters, some of those guys are pretty slender. I still remember when Kobayashi appeared on the screen the scene, and everyone was like, "That guy, really?"
Right.
Oh goodness. Well, we can't wait. Oh my goodness. It's been wonderful talking Michigan football again with you, Aaron. We know it's really busy right now, both on the field, off the field, and everything in between on the Wolverines beat. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, guys. Thanks for having me.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
It was so nice talking to Aaron again and hearing his thoughts on Michigan. He follows the team so closely and has for years. Shehan, what were your takeaways from this? What did we learn?
Yeah, look, I hate to say this a little bit, but Aaron kind of backed up a lot of the concerns that I have about this Michigan team. Their issues on the offensive line, their lack of explosiveness, the issues that they might have against Alabama's secondary. I was really hoping that I'd get a little more optimism from talking to him, because obviously we've seen this game script get thrown out each of the last 2 years against TCU and against Georgia in different ways. And Alabama's a team that I think will be able to get them out of rhythm and be disruptive and force JJ McCarthy to make plays. And it is very concerning to me that he's still wondering if JJ McCarthy is fully healthy. That's been a huge dynamic for this team and some of their struggles the past couple weeks of the year. So I really wanted to come away a little more optimistic about what Michigan is and can be. I don't know that I feel that. Now, it was great to get more context on their defense, right? I mean, this is a Michigan defense, especially at linebacker and especially on the second level, that has been exceptional this year, just totally exceptional. And while obviously I do wish that they maybe had the elite edge setting guys like an Aiden Hutchinson, I think that maybe that would transform this defense. The fact that they play 4 guys and are constantly fresh is a good thing for me, especially when you head into a game where Alabama, look, some players might go down. It's good that you have guys with experience, but overall, I don't know. I wasn't personally moved on the Michigan front. How say you?
No, I agree. He deepened a lot of the thoughts I have, which then, therefore, going into the game, there's so many mysteries. It's like, well, okay, we're getting a Big Ten team out of the Big Ten. We're getting an SEC team out of the SEC. So after seeing conference play, you get into this mindset by the end of the regular season that, oh wow, this team is so good, it's so great. Then when you throw them out of their comfort zone or throw them against a team, you find out a little bit of the objective question starts to come out. It's a little less of the subjective house of mirrors. So it sounds like, again, the concern is can Michigan establish kind of that power running game against Alabama? He confirmed that. I didn't get any faith. Blake Curran has to play the best game of his life. Well, okay, that it's easy to say that, or some of these guys, like can Donovan Edwards step up? I'm like, he had trouble stepping up against some of these other programs. How is he going to suddenly step up against Alabama? Of course, I don't want to lose perspective about the fact that Michigan has played exceptional defenses several times and in the final stretch of the game. I mean, Penn State is still a great defense. Ohio State, still a great defense. Iowa is only a great defense. So all of that together, I'm not sure if necessarily Alabama is going to throw something their way that they haven't seen before. That is what I'm hooking into to give Michigan's chance, because the offense isn't the greatest, but it can do enough. And if JJ McCarthy can't be mobile on his feet, that's one where I'm curious about, because they're like, well, he just needs to move around much. Well, he's been kind of injured and not really moving around much at all. I don't know what's going to happen between now and then. I know they're not tackling as much in practice, especially to start out this run up to this particular college football playoff, because they want these guys to be less banged up. But at the same time, I wonder how much of it is simply going to be just don't throw pick sixes. As crazy as that sounds, like, just control the errors. If he can do that, can this Michigan offense do just enough as they have in the last matchups they've had against top teams, especially with top defenses? I think that will be enough. But there's so many ifs there. There's so much question there, and the defense is so fascinating. And it's weird because Michigan's defense is great, but because there isn't that superstar that we can hook onto, like a Devondre Sweat, like or as you have mentioned, the past great Michigan edge rushers, we kind of don't talk about them as much, but they are the unsung heroes of this team. I mean, they are the ones that are carrying the Wolverines through. And I'm not sure how well they're going to be able to contain Jalen Milroe. I didn't hear anything that made me go, other than their weaknesses certainly in that offensive line, and we talked a little bit about that. It's going to be fascinating to see how they strategize for disrupting the offensive line and getting back there and putting Milroe on the run a little bit. But yeah, I don't feel any different, which means hey, I have a lot. I'm looking forward to this game. But yeah, I couldn't tell you if I'm going to think Michigan's going to have an edge after that conversation.
Well, and again, look, we had the conversation with Matt Stahl earlier this week from AL.com, and he kind of acknowledged this is not necessarily, from an interior perspective, an elite Alabama defensive line group, right? This isn't 2021 Georgia up front necessarily. Now, they do some things on the edge. I think that they have potentially an even better secondary than some of those Georgia teams, but maybe, like, again, I do have to stay open-minded to the idea that maybe Michigan will be able to stay to their plan, right? Will be able to continually move the ball, will be able to hold on, and that they don't need to be explosive in order to make it happen. I think for me, and this is probably a question I should have asked, is when you look at these Big Ten teams, and I hate reducing college football playoff and national championship teams to their conferences, because I just don't think that's very helpful. Every team is individual. The fact of reducing teams to their conference is how Alabama got into the stupid playoff. But at the same time, I think that it's hard for me, right? We've played national championship games since 1998. There's only been one team from the Big Ten that's won a title since then. And it's an Ohio State team that I think recruits and plays a lot more like a national type of team than a regional type of team. And, when you look at the Big Ten, right? Like, I mean, Wisconsin, incredible program, so much consistency, reached such a high level, but there's a cap on it because of what they do and how they want to play. Michigan is better, there's no doubt, than any Wisconsin team that's come through the past couple of years. I don't want to make that comparison, but are they like super Wisconsin, right? Are they elite Wisconsin? Whereas Ohio State, during those title years, during 2002, during 2014, is more like Alabama or Georgia, right? Like, what is the exact vision for this team if it hits this total peak? And again, when you're playing in the Big Ten, there's not a lot of teams on the schedule, especially that Michigan got this year, that will stress that perspective, right? If you're able to win that battle up front, like Michigan is able to do, you can just win the ball game. You can never be pushed off schedule. I just don't know if it works the same way when you play not just SEC teams, but teams outside of your conference that obviously have the history of playing different types of football and different types of teams. And I think that Michigan has a big opportunity to, one, prove me wrong, which I will certainly own if that is the case, and two, prove some of the doubters of Big Ten football wrong. But I also wonder if they were to lose this year. I don't by any means want to make a comparison to Ohio State losing 3 of their big games in a row, but I'm curious if Michigan goes in and kind of says, we have to hire our version of 2017 offensive coordinator Ryan Day to revamp what we're doing, to get us ready for the national stage. And I don't know. It's going to be a fascinating dynamic over the next couple of years, whether Michigan wins this game or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've drawn some interesting thoughts that we've talked about in the past. Is Michigan designed simply to beat Ohio State, or can they actually go on and beat teams in the playoff? Because again, sometimes you get so into what it takes to win, especially in the Big Ten, especially if you're in the Big Ten West, like Wisconsin. But when you get them into these kinds of mixed up matchups with programs that aren't necessarily as focused on that, I'd be very curious to see that. And as far as a reset in the future, this is going to be the offseason that'll allow them to do it, only because they've got so many seniors on that program. They're going to be an opportunity to change up a little bit of what they do if they feel that it wasn't sufficient, especially depending on how the Rose Bowl goes. If it's a close game, I think there isn't a whole lot to say about Michigan not being enough. I think we can't take away the fact that Alabama is a great program. I mean, I know you said well, it's still a conference. Yeah, they just beat Georgia though. Georgia was pretty good. My goodness, I can't wait to see how all of this pans out. Well, I think that's a good spot to wrap this up. On behalf of all of us here, we wanted to thank you for listening to the College Football Survivor Show. Our guest, Aaron McMann, he was the chief beat writer covering Michigan for MLive Group. He still does. You can find him there, as well as at Aaron McMann. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak and Shehan. You can find me as part of Reddit CFB on the Twitters. Thanks for listening, everybody.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.